This video is about the Piedmont Aquifer system. I want to describe in this video the conceptual model for the aquifer system, and we'll see that this consists of saprolite, transition zone, and fractured rock. The aquifer system is what's considered a local flow system, and we also want to take a look at the hydrologic properties as part of the video. So the Piedmont Aquifer System is in the eastern United States, and it's this light purple region right in here. It extends up into New England and looks something like that. This is this region right in here is the Valley and Ridge, and that's on the western side of the Piedmont system. The Piedmont system also consists of these green Triassic basins. And if you look carefully, you can see the stippling up here in the northern part on the map. The boundary, the stippled boundary is right around in here, and this is glaciated. So there's a cover of glacial sediments, and in the south it's unglaciated. So this is an overview of what I want to talk about. The geology, the geologic materials, the aquifer properties, and then the fluxes, flow system, and consumptive use of water, and the chemistry. We're going to focus on the hydrogeology, but it'll be important to take a preliminary look anyway at the geology and the history of how the geology formed. So we'll start with that. This is a cross-section of a paper by Bob Hatcher, and it summarizes the development of the Piedmont aquifer system and through time. So it starts here at the close of the Grenville orogeny up here at the top, where North America and Africa are together, and then in the late Precambrian there's tectonic extension and opening up of the Iapetus Sea, and then that continues through the late Precambrian and into the early Cambrian. And the thing that's important to recognize here, and I've shaded this in yellow and green, is this island arc system here, or just an island system in this Theocritic ocean in the late Precambrian. And there are these two fragments that will end up as part of the Piedmont terrain on the North American continent. And so what happens is a convergent margin develops right here, and the Piedmont island arc system moves to the west relative to the North American craton. And during the tectonic orogeny, this Piedmont terrain is thrust up onto the craton. You can see there's a thrust fault right in here, and that at this scale, it's a large scale thrusting up onto the continent, but there are also internally many smaller thrust faults and overturned folds. Folds as a kind of evidence of this very large scale tectonic compression. And then that occurred in the Ordovician Silurian time frame, and then a while later in the Devonian to early Carboniferous, the Akkadian orogeny occurred, and that occurred because this other landmass that was out in the ocean arrives at the craton and gets sutured onto the craton right here, and that's the Avalon terrain. And you can see it during the Akkadian orogeny, it arrives here and gets sutured on. And then later on in the Permian, the Alleghenian orogeny, that occurs when Africa right here arrives. So these three main orogenies that shaped the eastern U.S. during the Paleozoic really occurred as these different land masses arrive and collide with the North American craton. And so what we end up with is this Piedmont terrain here and the Avalon terrain, sometimes also called the Carolina terrain in the southern Appalachians, and then Africa here. And of course, this will change. There'll be a spreading center that forms during the Mesozoic, and Africa will move back out, but it leaves behind these guys that form the Piedmont terrain. And here's what it looks like in map view of the whole eastern U.S. This is a map by Bob Hatcher and his colleagues. And you can see the boundary for the inner Piedmont terrain is right here in the southern Appalachians. And there's the inner Piedmont. And then this thing here, this green body, it's called the Carolina terrain, and that's this piece that came in afterwards and gets sutured onto the continent afterwards. And then you can see here to the west the Blue Ridge region and the folded Appalachians here that form the Appalachian origin. So we can take a look. This blue box shows the area of a more detailed map that was also done by Bob Hatcher and his colleagues, and that's here. And just to orient you, this is Greenville, South Carolina, and Anderson, South Carolina, and Clemson is right around up in here. And so this is our home territory, and you can see that the bedrock geology shown here is really quite complicated. If we look up here at this cross section, well, here's this cross section right here, CC prime, is shown right here, and what's going on here is that this is a thrust sheet that's right here. There's a fault right here, and the region on top has moved in that direction relative to the region on the bottom. And internally, you can see the light and darker tan colors. Those are some steep overturned folds like that, folds called naps. And the complicated geology consists of a series of thrust sheets. Here's a thrust sheet, and then there's a smaller one right here, and there's a band like this, and you can see here this is a very complexly folded region right in here, and so these are a series of thrust sheets that are stacked one on top of another as the shortening occurred along this convergent margin. And so that's kind of the big picture. From a hydrogeologic point of view, the rocks that occur in this region are fairly similar, broadly similar, I guess, from a hydrogeologic point of view, in that they're metamorphic rocks, and they're generally quite low primary porosity and quite low permeability, and as a result, they form fairly poor aquifers unto themselves. They are fractured, however, and the fracturing increases the permeability and does allow some transmission of water, and the fractures then are really the things that are responsible for the aquifer development. And so here we see a map of North Carolina with the Piedmont region shown in green. and the Blue Ridge is shown over on the western side in blue. On the right side is the coastal plain, and in cross section, we see the Piedmont region here, and it consists of the inner Piedmont belt, and we can see the Carolina region here that we saw on the previous slide, and we have the Charlotte belt here, which is another fragment that is sutured onto the craton. Okay, so that's the big picture. This is a rock type that is typical in the inner Piedmont. This is gneiss. It consists of biotite and sometimes hornblende, the darker minerals, feldspars, the white color minerals, and quartz, and typically forms these banded patterns. And you can see the small scale folding that's shown in these samples as well. This is a result of the large deformations that we saw previously. So these are crystalline rock. They're quite resistant. They're very low permeability and porosity. But they also are composed of minerals that are formed at high pressures and temperatures, feldspars and micas and hornblendes. And these minerals are not particularly stable at the ground surface. And so what that'll form well, we'll see a consequence of that. But before we get there, one of the things we have to recognize is that these rocks are fractured, and the fractures play an important role in their properties and their performance as a aquifer material. So on the left is a quarry in some crystalline material that, and we can see a fracture right along here, and the fracture is water is flowing out of the fracture, and you can see this darker color right in here is water that's flowing out, and water is also flowing down this face. And you can see also a fracture trace right here, and water is flowing out of that. There are a variety of other fractures. Here's some vertical fractures where we don't see water. And you have to be careful in exposures like this, because some of these fractures may be formed from blasting and not really part of the ambient fracture system. But certainly some of the fractures, like the ones that have water seeping out of them, are pre-existing and part of the fracture system that would allow water to flow through the subsurface. Over here we see a bigger fracture that's flat-lying and has a lot of smaller scale fracturing within it, and also some weathering along that fracture. And we see a vertical fracture right there. And so this combination of horizontal fractures and vertical fractures are really what we need to form a system of fractures that will percolate and allow water to circulate. And down here at the bottom in the middle, I show a close-up of a fracture in some granite. And, we think of fractures as being like this slot that is an open slot, but actually fractures are supported by small roughness, small bumps on their surfaces, asperities, and the asperities are in contact across the fracture and provides support. Like you can see an asperity right there and right there. And actually the fracture, as you go out laterally right over here, it seems as if the fracture has kind of petered out. It's hard to see any fracture. So really what we get from this is that this fracture is like an elongated pore, like this. And we can have water flowing through it. It's about a millimeter or two wide, but and it's much broader than it is long, but it is finite length. So it would be the interconnection of elongate open fractures like this that would allow fluid to flow through these crystalline rocks. Okay, so now we've got this question, rock or dirt? Well, the on the previous slide, we clearly were seeing some rocks, and I show here some rocks that are folded nice, and that's also what's shown here. And these are resistant rocks. They're fresh rock. You can hit them with a hammer, and maybe you could break off a small chunk, but they're pretty strong. But around here in the Piedmont area, what you often find at shallow depths is material that looks like this, shown here in this bottom picture. And I want to just point out the banding here. So there's some more banding, and then there's a discontinuity right here, probably a fault right there, and what's happening here is this stuff right here. That was some folds in gneiss, much like we see up in the two upper pictures. In the two upper pictures we see some resistant rock, but the material in the bottom was dug out with a shovel, and so it's very weak and can be easily removed with a shovel. And in fact, this exposure that you're seeing was revealed by digging it out with a shovel. And so this material is called saprolite, and it's altered gneiss. It inherits the fabric from the gneiss and the structure, the folds, but the minerals have been changed and that creates a big change in the strength of the material. It also creates a big change in the hydraulic properties, particularly the porosity and the permeability. So here's what happens during the weathering process. If we start with crystalline material, like I show in the upper right, this is a granite, and it consists of these pink minerals that are feldspars, and the black minerals, which are biotite, and then the gray minerals, which are quartz. So let's see, there are the three different minerals, and what I've done is to take this image in the upper right, this photograph of granite, and in the lower right, I'm just showing this schematically, this collection of feldspar, quartz, and biotite. And what happens then during the weathering process is the feldspar weathers to clay when it's exposed to water and oxygen. It will weather to clay. Biotite weathers to iron oxides and clay. And the quartz, it doesn't really weather. It doesn't really change during the weathering process. But biotite and feldspar do. And if you look up here at this granite, you can see that the biotite and feldspar form kind of an interconnected backbone. The quartz is there, and it's an important component of this material. But if we take a look at this schematic down here, you can see that the way I've drawn this, the quartz grains are isolated, and the feldspar and biotite is interconnected. And so what happens during the weathering process is that the feldspar and biotites change, and I'm going to show this with some animation here. So these guys change. The feldspars weather to clay, and the biotite weathers to iron oxide. And so now you have material that started out looking like granite, starting out as granite, and now it's saprolite, and it still has the fabric, the same fabric that it started with, but the minerals have changed. And one of the important consequences of this is that feldspar is a strong mineral, and when it's intergrown with these other strong crystalline minerals, we have quite a strong rock. But clay and iron oxide are readily fractured. And so when we have a material that's altered like this, we can easily cut it with a shovel because we can have fractures that go through it and go around these quartz grains. The quartz is still strong, but it's not really forming the overall structural integrity of the material. Okay, so that's saprolite, and that occurs in the Piedmont at the ground surface and down to some depth that's dictated by the depth of the weathering. So this is one of several conceptual models that we'll see for the Piedmont, and it consists of an upper region that is saprolite and a lower region that's fractured metamorphic rock, like that gneiss that we saw. There are also igneous rocks in this area, and you can see the fractures here shown schematically. And then what's often recognized is that there's a zone between the saprolite and the metamorphic rock that's a transition zone. And I think it makes sense that something like that would happen because the saprolite is much different than the metamorphic rock in strength and physical properties. And this transformation occurs over some kind of a transition zone shown here. And I should also point out that this line right here is the water table. So the water table typically occurs in the saprolite. Okay, so we have these three zones: fractured rock, saprolite, and a transition zone. And one thing that is often recognized is that the thickness of the transition zone varies depending upon the composition of the parent material. In foliated rocks, like gneisses and schists, the transition zone is relatively narrow, maybe a few meters, maybe 5 meters or so. But in areas that are underlain by granites or granitoids or rocks that are relatively massive and don't have the layering, then the transition zone is much broader. There are pieces of relatively unweathered rock up at shallow depths, but then the zone where there is significant weathering along the fractures occurs fairly deep. Okay, so this is an important conceptual model to keep in mind because often this transition zone is determined by drilling, and you drill down using a drilling method like a augering method that is extended down until you hit something that's resistant and can't be penetrated by the auger, and then that's recognized as the transition zone. But if you were to do that here in this, and I mean that would work pretty well in areas that are underlain by gneiss or schist, but over here, if we were to drill down and hit this rock right here, we would think that the transition zone, or maybe we would think that we hit bedrock and hit some solid rock, and in fact, there would be this fairly broad transition zone that we would still need to go through before we got into some unweathered rock down here. So that's important to keep in mind. So the idea of understanding or recognizing and distinguishing fractured rock, saprolite, and transition zone was developed further by Malcolm Schaefer and his colleagues when they were characterizing several different sites for power plants, shown here. And they looked at foliated layered sites as well as massive plutonic sites. And what they did was to develop criteria that are generated from the drilling and sampling process that could be used to objectively identify fractured rock, intact rock, the transition zone, and different saprolite zones. And that scheme is shown here, where you can see here we've got the M1 and M2. These are the two saprolite zones. Here's the transition zone, and this D is called sound rock. And the scheme that was developed makes use of this N value here. And the N value is the number of blows that it takes to drive a sampling hammer 6 inches. This is called the standard penetration tests. And for N less than 100, you can see that that generates a criteria of M1 for the soil saprolite. Then when N is greater than 100 and or the recovery is less than 50%, then that's M2. And the recovery is the percent recovery of the sampling method, either from coring or split spoon sampling. And then RQD, that's a that's a term that's used to describe the percent of pieces of core longer than 10 centimeters. So the higher the RQD, the more sound the rock is, because the more long pieces of intact core are generated. So sound rock is based on an RQD of greater than 50%, and this transition zone of partially weathered or fractured rock is an RQD less than 50%. So these measures allow the identification of transition zone and these other zones in an objective way. And what this allowed Malcolm to do, well, so here's an example. This is a transition zone that is between 83 feet and 95 feet. And what we're seeing here on the left-hand side is the log that was generated from this cord hole. You can see that there's places where the core was not recovered, core loss, and then places here where there was core, and some descriptions of the core, along with the recovery percent and the RQD, the rock quality designation. Here's a picture of some of the core, and you can see some of these fractures are natural fractures. You can see this dark greenish color from weathering, and then down below that, this more gray color. That's more of the color of the intact unweathered rock. So we're going through this transition zone from weathered to unweathered material. And also this area, or this well, this hole was completed as a well and tested, and the hydraulic conductivity was around 10 to the minus 6 meters per second in the transition zone. So and there were a variety of tests done like this, and this provides a nice connection between a description of the subsurface, what the rock is like, and what the properties of the aquifer are like.